here we are at MCA. We're just dropping the Supra off, and we're going to have a quick chat to Josh, and they're going to they've just got it up on the hoist there. Josh, we're now in your capable hands. Yep. What is your plans for this car?
Well, you're after quite a lot of things, obviously. You know, a bit of everything.
As I always do, I like to be annoying.
So that's obviously the hardest sort of thing to try and set up for, is a lot of different types of applications. So yeah, we're just going to, you know, I've tried to come up with a pretty versatile sort of setup. Sometimes these really sort of, these tricky ones, you know, sometimes we've got to sort of drive the car before we really realise that we've really nailed it. Yeah, in this case we get to do that, and I think it'll be, I think we'll hit the nail on the head pretty well with this one.
Excellent. And we're going to also try something a little bit new for you as well, with some adjustable ride height.
Yeah. So we've got the Stanceparts air cups in there.
Now, we aren't going airbag suspension. When you first look at this, you might think this is airbag, but it's not. These sit on top of your suspension struts and give you an extra 2 inches of lift. Like if you've seen our Lambo video, you press a button and it makes the suspension go up and down. So it's the suspension lift. It height adjusts the front so it goes up and down. So you press that button there, it'll make the suspension lift about 3 inches or drop 3 inches back to its normal place. We'll be able to do that in the Supra now, so we can actually make the front and back go up and down 2 inches. That'll be sick. So no more getting stuck in driveways because the car's too low or any of that.
And yeah, I actually tried to fit a set of those up to my 860 the other day. We need to make a few little changes to get them all working. They're actually quite complex and not as straightforward as you may think to make work with the setup and have everything work properly. So yeah, thankfully in the Supra, just because I guess it's a bit bigger car and the wheel arches are a bit bigger and things like that, there's a bit more room for the shocks. They're actually fitting in there quite a lot easier. And the shocks are a bit longer, so we can incorporate that into the design a lot easier. So yeah, it should be a lot more streamlined process in this case. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see how that goes.
And hopefully we get the best of both worlds. We get the low life and the handling.
Yeah, yeah, that's the plan.
Cool. All right, well, I'll leave that up to you and I'll come back a little bit later on.
Cool.
Cheers, mate.
Righto.
See you in a bit. All right, so while waiting for the Supra to go get its suspension done down at MCA, we figured we'd pop by GT, and we're going to go take this puppy out for a drive when it's finished. It's up on the hoist at the moment, getting a few final touches. It's got air conditioning and everything, so it's getting wide at the moment. So very shortly, we're going to be taking this thing out on the street. We're going to do a proper episode about it a little bit later on, but this is just to fill in a gap while we wait for the Supra to go get its suspension. Have a play with this for a little while, and then we will head back to MCA. You'll hear the whining sound as the gearbox. It's a straight cut gearbox, 6-speed sequential from Albans with paddle shifts, as you see up here. It gets confusing because I keep going for the normal gear shifter down here, but it doesn't exist anymore. So, and we're going to encounter a lot of traffic probably because it is peak hour. Straight down. So we've got the car back to GT Auto. We had a little bit of a drama on the way back. Nothing big. We weren't sure what was going on. It was idling really high, and there was no brake pedal feel, so we sort of limped it back here. It turned out all it was is one of these lines here for the, see if I can focus it. They go to the brake booster, so the vacuum lines here. One of them had undone, so basically it was making it idle extraordinarily high. But now the car's fixed again, so successful first drive of this car. A little bit sketchy, 28 pound we accidentally, like Davo told me it was running 14 pound, turns out he was lying, and 28 pound got a little carried away with the right hand, sorry, the right foot, and it skipped sideways across a couple of lanes. So these tyres, as good as they are, we might be running 295 semi-slicks front and rear. Not quite enough to prevent loss of traction, so we're going to need bigger tyres, I think. There's some sticks in here, that's weird. But anyway, that was our adventure. Now back to MCA to see how the Supra's going. All right, I'll catch you back there. All right, so we've left the Supra with the guys at MCA Suspension for a little while, and now we're going to drop in and have a chat to them and see how they're going with it. And we're also going to have a chat to Josh from MCA and get him to give us a bit of a rundown of the ins and outs of what's good and what's bad about different types of suspension and what makes our setup so important. So we'll have a chat to Josh now. How to drive?
Yeah, good.
Yeah?
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that.
Nice.
Not much as we can do around here anyway.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Look what you did to my boost gauge, mate. That was all you.
It's been like that.
Yeah, I'm sure you did that.
You can go pretty quick.
So what are we doing here?
We're jacking the wheel up to check to see how far the wheel can go, and basically because we've already got some measurements off of this sort of model car, we're just checking that those measurements are still fine with your car in particular, and that we've accounted for the air cups properly and all that sort of thing. So yeah, we're just seeing where the wheel stops once the shock's fully compressed.
Okay, so we know where the bump stop would need to be.
We know as high up as the wheel's going to go, and we can make adjustments if we need to.
And it would normally hit the inner guard first, or is that what we're...
It varies. So your tyre, I can see here, is getting pretty close to this area, which it looks like it already has been a little bit, because I can see how it's sort of shaved around that sort of shape of the tyre.
It goes lower than I thought it would. That's surprising.
See,
I didn't realise there's that much room in the guards.
Yeah, Supra's got pretty good guards of compression, and probably about 50... Well, we don't really know what happens, but we'll film what happens.
Do these scrub at all?
I don't know yet. Looks like with a bit of lock it might.
This is what I ran into the other day. I'm going to have to run 10mm spacers to clear the brakes.
Oh, okay. That's it? That's cool. From the previous ride height. So we got 595. So 60mm of droop and plenty of movement travel. Absolutely miles. Bang on 50. Yeah, okay.
Alright, so explain to us what this machine does, and the part that's in it, I guess, is something that comes out of
the damper. Some people might call it the insert. It's basically the main unit of the shock absorber. This is where all the valving and the oil and the gas and everything is. So basically if you have a look at a normal sort of shock absorber like that, it's all together. This part here is, you can sort of see that part there, so the main body and the shaft. So yeah, this is a shock dyno. It's quite an old one, but it works well and it does the trick. So what this does is basically it'll move that shaft in and out. It'll rate the, basically give us a graph for how much resistance there is for the valving inside. So that sort of tells us, to a degree how stiff or soft it is. You can then make adjustments to the shock absorber, and you'll see the differences on the graph. So you can see sort of how much difference the adjustments are making. We use this mainly to make sure that our valving shim packs are nice and equal, the same left and rights, things like that. We also use it when I'm sort of developing new shim packs to make sure that we've sort of got, whatever the new design is, that it's sort of in the money before we start too much testing. So we use it mainly for quality control and just making sure that everything's consistent and equal. So like it wouldn't be if someone said that their car was for a specific purpose, you wouldn't change the type of valving? So for our Red Series and for our Street Ultimates, the valving is customized to order. In those cases, I'll sort of, because I've done a fair bit by now, I sort of already have a bit of an idea on what shim pack to use or how to modify it and things like that. I'll use this to sort of make sure that what I've done is what it's ended up as is what I wanted. The valving I like to do, I try and keep it very versatile. So if people are wanting to change spring rates, not having to revalve them and things. A lot of brands talk about needing to revalve, shocks as soon as you start changing spring rates and things like that. Whereas that's not really the case. That's taking things a little bit too specific, a little bit too detailed. You know, really with the help of a damper adjuster in there, there's quite a range of adjustment. Like you can, you know, there could be like a 6 or 7 kilo spring range that you could use on the same damper without having to even worry about revalving at all. I mean, obviously, again, it depends on what you're doing. If we're talking about absolute circuit racing, that might be a little bit different, where every little bit matters. If we're talking about mainly just road cars and things like that, then it's you know, it's more important that just the customer's happy with how the car rides and feels, and it's less important as to the absolute nitty-gritties of how everything's going to work, because it's never really going to see those limits of how it's used.
So we've talked about our damper rates and everything. Now onto springs while the car's still apart. What do you take into consideration when you go to set up the vehicle, and what spring rates you're going to choose for this one?
So there's a lot of things we take into consideration with spring rates. For starters, the car's weight, not just the total weight, but what the weight is on the front axle and the rear axle separately. From there, we've also got to take into account the motion ratio. That's one of the most critical things that a lot of people don't understand, don't know about. So the motion ratio is basically the leverage that the wheel has over the spring and damper. So sometimes the shocks might be mounted right out at the wheel on the hub. Generally speaking, that might be a 1-to-1 motion ratio, about the same. So what that means is that the wheel moves the same distance as the shock absorber, and there's no extra leverage going on. Whereas in some cases, like say the front of the Supra, the shock is a fair way in on the suspension arm, which actually creates a sort of, the wheel then has leverage. It's like getting like if you're struggling to undo a certain nut and bolt, you go and grab a bigger spanner, and then all of a sudden it's easier. It's a similar sort of deal. The further away the wheel is from the shock absorber and spring, basically the more leverage, the easier it is for that to move. So you actually have to beef up the valving in the spring to compensate for the motion ratio.
All right, cool. So inside our shock, I know you're saying that the dyno can measure the damping and all that stuff. Yep. You were talking about valving and that. How does that work, and what is it?
This is a typical valving package. So we've got our piston here, and then we've got these little thin metal discs on either side. Okay, and so basically that's running up there, and that's going up and down inside the body like that. Okay, and then as it's doing that, there's oil all around it. This is basically sealed to the inside of the body here, so there's like oil on top and oil underneath. And as that goes up, the oil from here has to come through these holes here, out here, and push these discs open and escape. And then as it goes down, the oil has to come back from this side through these holes, up through this hole here, which is covered, which you can't see through those discs there, and that'll actually push those discs open and flow through. So it's about the size of the holes, the shape of the holes, the number of the holes, as well as the thicknesses and how those shims on top there are stacked.
And that'll allow it to either move faster or slower through the oil.
Not so much faster or slower, but how much resistance is there while it's moving at that speed.
And what's the purpose of the gas that lives in there as well?
So there's a gas chamber up in here, and so basically that's there so that, as you can imagine, I always use the metaphor that if you have a cup full of water, you put your hand inside, all the water's going to overflow, or at least some of it is. And what's displaced is the volume of your hand going inside the cup. So in this case, say it's at full extension and the piston's down here somewhere, you've got all this shaft that's got to be able to go up inside there. But it's obviously full of oil, and so that would basically be hydraulic locked, and it can't happen. So what we do is we have a gas volume up in here, and so that compresses. So as the shaft goes up inside here, the gas volume compresses and basically allows for the extra volume of the shaft to be there. So this axis here is kilograms of force, and this is at millimeters per second, so that's speed. So there is a graph. On this side so this line upwards is the compression, and on this line down is the extension. And so basically this is saying that to move at this speed, it requires this amount of force. Okay. And from there, so it requires more force to extend than it does to compress. In this case, yeah. And that's quite normal, quite common. And so, and so from this, after this doesn't tell you everything about a shock and a setup straight away. This is really just a bit of a guide. It's something that can be quite useful for someone, like myself, or someone working with shock absorbers a lot, that's done a lot of valving, a lot of dynoing, and they just, they know how things work and how to relate to it. But yeah, it doesn't tell you absolutely everything.
Most shocks that you see, they've got little knobs at the top, and I've seen most of yours do also. What does that do inside, internally? Okay, so it's a really straightforward mechanism. So, a lot of the time you can hear the clicks.
So that's what people are adjusting when there's usually like a little knob on top or something like that. So yeah, they'll be adjusting these little clicks. And so what that's doing, if we have a look at the other end, so this is the end that's in the oil, you can see there's a hole through here. And so as the shaft's going up inside the body there, oil will pass through this hole and will come out these holes on the other side of the piston and valving. Okay. And so basically that's allowing oil to free flow past the shim pack and piston. So adjusting this basically just, you think of it like a tap. All you're doing is restricting, like there's a little needle inside that sort of plugs up that hole. And so, yeah, the tighter you adjust the shocks or the harder the setting is, basically the more restrictive that flow is. And then as you soften it off, you're opening up the tap and allowing it to flow easier.
Well, I don't know if all that confused you, but it's a little bit confusing to me. So hopefully we're able to help some people with what these, the importance of getting the valving right. So let's go back to our Supra. All right, so we glossed over the adjustability of the suspension. Show us how we go and set our damper rates.
Righto, so these are currently preset, but by us, all the shocks that we do up, we do preset in positions that we think are pretty good spots for people. But the way to check it is to count the way to full tight, full hard. So count the clicks, 1, 2, 3, 4. This one's actually on 5 here, so there we go. So that's full shut. Okay, now I call that position 0, that's our starting point. So then we count backwards, 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. And yeah, so that's now set at 4.
Cool, and then just do the same for the other side, and then that will get us our...
starting point.
Is that where you sort of set it to when you first get the car, and then they can adjust it?
Yeah, obviously people are welcome to adjust it from there, but that's what we think, that's where we think is a good starting point.
Cool. So, base height adjustment, what does this mean? And yeah.
Righto, I'll try and explain it. It's easier with visuals and things, but we'll see how we go. So, typically speaking, most other brands will say to use the bottom mount to adjust the height of the car. Now, the reason that this is, in my opinion, quite wrong is because it's actually a pretty critical adjustment. And so what the bottom mount actually controls is the wheel travel range. So if you think of it this way, the amount of distance the wheel can travel up and down is dictated by the amount of shaft in the shock absorber. And then where that travel is in relationship to the car is dictated by the length of the shock, which is adjusted by the bottom mount. So when you're adjusting the height by the bottom mount, you're not just adjusting the height, you're adjusting that wheel travel range with it. So that's where people will come across issues, as you've probably seen, where the tyres are sort of scrubbing up into the guards and things and hitting stuff they shouldn't be. Sometimes it's suspension arms hitting on chassis, sometimes it's brake lines getting tight. There's all sorts of things it can be. So basically the thing is that at some stage the wheel and the suspension assembly has to stop moving upwards in the wheel arch, because otherwise it's going to hit something, make contact with something, and that can be quite bad. So not just damaging your car, but it could really upset your suspension setup in a critical moment, for example. So the way that we do it, we spend a lot more time with each model car to start with, and we actually cycle the wheel up and down and sort of figure out where that wheel travel range needs to be, where it needs to stop, and yeah, we'll actually set the bottom mount position so that that's the case, and the wheel is stopping where we want it to stop. And so that way, every time we set up our shocks for our customers, as they leave here, they're set in that position, so they should have a nice, safe wheel travel range to work in.
So you will have already, this bit here is fixed. You don't want people to touch this part here.
That's correct.
And you want people to adjust this
by
movement.
the spring seats here.
Okay.
Yep. And so then a lot of people will say, well, that changes your spring preload. Well, spring preload doesn't actually make any difference pretty much on a normal tin top car. Like if we're talking about other cars like bikes, maybe open wheelers, things like that, that's different. But we're talking about normal sort of tin top cars, your normal sort of passenger vehicles and things. Doesn't make any difference, because at the end of the day there's still about 400 kilos or so of vehicle weight coming down on each spring, and that's going to compress it further than the 10-15 mil preload or whatever it is that you put on.
So that would only really be an impact if it was a progressive rate spring, but because they're linear springs, it shouldn't make any difference, right?
Progressive rate also doesn't make any difference.
Okay.
Yeah. At the end of the day, once you put that same amount of weight on the spring, which is say like your 400 kilos, the car's weight on that corner, Once you put that sort of weight on it, it's always going to compress to the same amount, whether it was progressive or linear. With the same weight, it's going to compress to the same length. So that's why, as far as the car is concerned, nothing's changed, you know, as far as the spring goes, because it's just going to compress it past what you did. And unless you're actually reaching those full extension points while driving around, which is extremely unlikely, and if you are, there's a problem with the setup for what you're doing. Yeah, if you're not reaching full extension, then the car doesn't even know that you've preloaded the spring, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And so this is the bit that we move up and down,
yep.
and that's everything else stays fixed.
So it's really simple.
Yep.
It's really straightforward. It's quicker and easier, in my opinion, to adjust it from here instead of that. In most of the cases, because we're dealing with more sports or performance sort of, you know, setups, the springs are reasonably firm, so we're not having to preload them massive amounts or anything like that. So it's honestly quicker and easier to do it this way as well. It just means that we've had to do a lot more homework to start with than a lot of the other brands have.
Okay, cool. Well, that clears that one up.
Cool.
Now we're going to test out these Stanceparts air cups and see if we can get them to activate just using an air compressor to start with as a test. You'll start playing Snoop Dogg or something. That's cool. Alright, so the suspension is in. We've set the new ride height, and Josh, what did you think? Like now that you've had a go at driving it?
Yeah, I just took it for a drive. Yeah, and it sort of, you know, handles just like I expected, really. It was nice and sharp on the turn-in, nice and responsive. You know, it's a little on the firm side of comfortable, but you're going to have to sacrifice that kind of thing when you want something that's going to, you know, perform on the track as well. Yeah, it's a little bit on the firm side of that comfortable sort of area, but I went full soft on the damper adjustments on the rear, and I found that just sort of take the edge off a little bit. So I think it's perfectly livable and quite pleasant, really, for sort of like a sports car. Yeah, and like I said, it turns in really nice and sharp. There's very minimal body roll. I think it'll be really good.
Cool. Well, I think when we're out at QR next, I might throw you the keys and you have some laps in it.
Yeah, we can do that.
Cheers.
You've got some better tyres on there than these.
Oh yeah, no, we've got some good tyres going on. Yeah. Don't worry about that. But thank you very much for today and showing us all that. And we will touch base with you when we get the new brakes and tyres and wheels on, because we're probably going to need to maybe limit some suspension move there. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how we go. Thanks very much for that.
Cool.
Have a great week.
Okay.
See you, mate.